Welcome everybody, and I'd like to begin this event by going straight to Ms. Tai Tai to make some opening comments. She is the Chief of Gender, Equality and Social Inclusion Section and Social Development Division of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and leads UNESCAP's regional programs on advancing gender equality and disability inclusive development in Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. It's a great pleasure to join this side event on disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction and management. I'd like to thank the Institute of Global Development and the Disability Innovation Institute of University of New South Wales for organizing this event and fostering a discussion on such an important topic. Asia and the Pacific is the most disaster-prone region in the world. Due to the effects of climate change, the number and the intensity of disasters are expected to increase. These disasters disproportionately affect persons with disabilities. It is estimated that the mortality rate for persons with disabilities is 2 to 4 times higher than for persons without disabilities. As with all disaster risk reduction efforts, preparation and planning are key to reducing risk. Too often, though, persons with disabilities are left out of disaster risk reduction processes. Without inputs based on the expertise of persons with disabilities, barriers to finding safety during disasters remain. For example, wheelchair users struggle to find accessible evacuation routes in tsunamis and other disasters. Deaf persons are not aware of imminent disaster warnings because of a reliance on fire alarms and audio announcements. Persons with intellectual disabilities do not understand emergency announcements and instructions given on television. These are just a few examples of life-threatening situations where the risks could have been reduced through comprehensive accessibility measures. The perspectives and experience of persons with disabilities must play a key role in identifying needs and creating plans for disaster risk reduction, including information accessibility, evacuation routes, and the provision of personal assistance. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Incheon Strategy, and Beijing Action Plan all pushed for a paradigm shift in understanding disability in disasters. Instead of the impairment being seen as an inherent vulnerability of persons with disabilities, these agreements assert that physical, informational, attitudinal, and institutional barriers are the true impediments to effective disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction. Over the past 10 years, UNESCAP has contributed to this paradigm shift and promoted disability-inclusive DRR. We advocated for the draft Sendai framework to be disability-inclusive by organizing an expert group meeting held just before the Global Sendai Conference on DRR in 2015. UNESCAP has also participated in several key regional meetings and created an e-learning tool on the paradigm shift and disability inclusive DRR that is available in English, Japanese, and a few more other languages that are being in the making. Currently, the disaster risk reduction section in UNESCAP and the Social Development Division of UNESCAP are collaborating on a project to further these efforts. We are working with the governments of Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Philippines to create a customized e-learning tools in each country's respective context and language. These tools are based in part on the outcomes of a regional consultation, which identified implementation gaps. And the tools will focus on the barriers that must be removed for effective disaster-inclusive disaster risk reduction. Policymakers throughout the region must make this same paradigm shift towards focusing on removing barriers and working in partnership with government disability focal points, organizations of persons with disabilities, and their allies to create and implement inclusive policies. I'm sure this eminent panel will lead to fruitful discussions, and I wish you a successful event. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you to promote and ensure the safety of the 700 million persons with disabilities in the Asia-Pacific region during disasters. I thank you.
Thank you for that introduction and welcome, Hai-Tai. Welcome to the rest of this webinar. My name is Jackie Leach-Scully and I'm Professor of Bioethics at University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia, and also Director of the Disability Innovation Institute there. And this webinar is organised jointly by the Disability Innovation Institute, the DIIU, and the Institute of Global Development, also at UNSW. Now, as we've just heard, people with disability are disproportionately affected by disasters and health emergencies, and also that the position of people with disability in these situations is made worse by their exclusion from active participation in disaster risk reduction programs and policies. So this is the situation that we've asked our panelists to address. They're all practitioner scholars with expertise in disability, development, and or disasters. And we've asked them to consider from their perspectives and with their expertise, emerging issues at the intersection of disability and other marginal identities, for example, and development, emphasizing public health and disability policies, but in the Asia-Pacific context of disaster risk. And we hope that the discussion will move towards identifying some commitments on what the priority issues are so that we can consolidate solutions and thereby help people with disability and increase resilience. We have 3 panelists at the moment. We have planned for 4, and we hope that the 4th will be able to join us, but we will start with our 3, and I'm going to introduce all 3 of them before the panel starts so that we don't interrupt too much. Their detailed biographies are in the concept note, so if you want more detail, then please look there. But I will introduce them now briefly, and then we've asked our panelists to give their input, and when that is done, we will open for discussion. So first of all, Ms. Rosemary Kayes is an internationally recognised human rights lawyer in the area of disability. She is the chair of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and chairperson of the UN Treaty Body Chairperson. Rosemary is a senior academic in the Faculty of Law at UNSW, and she has also advised on numerous projects in human rights and disability and the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Australia, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe. Second, we will hear from Michelle Villeneuve. Associate Professor Michelle Villeneuve is Deputy Director at the University of Sydney Impact Centre for Disability Research and Policy. She's also an activity lead at the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Strengthening Rehabilitation Capacity in Health Systems. She leads research on disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction in Australia, and with over 20 years of experience of working in regions of conflict and natural hazard disaster to develop community-led programs and services and rebuild opportunities for people with disability. And that includes those with disability acquired because of human conflict, as well as natural disaster. And thirdly, Ms. Wisnawati Utami, who is founder of OHANA Indonesia, a disability rights organization in Yogyakarta. She focuses on disability rights and policy advocacy. She is also a wheelchair user due to contracting polio at the age of 4. Rizna has been active in various activities related to disability issues, human rights, wheelchair provision, urban development and policy advocacy in Indonesia and also at the international level. She received the International Advocate Award from the United States International Council on Disabilities in 2017. Her experience with research and policy development grounds her expertise at the intersection of public health, community development, policy, and disability. And so with that, I'm going to ask Rosemary Kayes to begin our contemplation and conversation.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to speak with you today. And what I'd like to really do is just sort of set out some of the parameters in terms of international law and the work of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and link it to the state obligations that are found under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Our experience is with disaster risk reduction and the state obligations that are found under Article 11 are that people with disabilities are not included. Whilst there are clear connections between the various forms of situations of risk and emergencies, so we've seen clear connections between the pandemic, situations of armed conflict such as the Ukraine or West Papua, and disasters such as emerging climate change natural disasters, so the Pakistani floods, the Australian bushfires, that there's the experiences of people with disability have been consistent. It's a pattern of being excluded. So the experience of COVID repeatedly demonstrated the pandemic response and recovery plans did not consider people with disability. There was limited information, limited accessible information, limited access to protective equipment and support, which put people with disabilities at increased risk, as well as the wider community. And there were heightened risks in institution and congregate care settings where people could be locked in their rooms for many hours per day, and an increase in other restrictive practices, but also a heightened increase in terms of the prevalence of the disease. In the Ukraine, we've seen situations in refugee transit zones where there's limited accessibility, limited access to essential aids and equipment, and understanding and recognition of the obligation of reasonable accommodation. And so also in the Ukraine, we've noticed that people with disabilities in institutions are again at exacerbated risk in these situations. They've been used as human shields. They've been left without essential equipment and medication. And as a result, people are dying. It's also the situation that humanitarian aid corridors are not getting through. Those workers in humanitarian aid are not necessarily connected with organisations of people with disabilities, so getting humanitarian aid to people with disabilities has been difficult. And then the situations of disasters are increasing. The increase in climate change disasters such as the Pakistan floods and the Australian bushfires, and the impact of global warming will have significant impact in terms of people with disability and their ability to be able to maintain social networks and maintain access to their required daily supports and living. Article 11 of the Convention sets out the obligations on states. The CRPD is the first human rights treaty to set out binding obligations on states parties for the protection and safety of people with disability. in situations of risk. Article 11 of the CRPG is entitled Situation of Risks and Humanitarian Emergencies. It requires governments to take in accordance with their obligations under international law, including humanitarian law and international human rights law, all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including situations of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and the occurrence of natural disasters. Article 11 requires governments to consider how all other rights are applied in situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. This means, in the context of all responses, that all responses should be applied in a way that ensures all human rights are fulfilled, and that actions should not diminish the rights of people with disabilities. They should facilitate these rights. Article 11 requires measures to respect, protect, and fulfill other rights, such as the right to life, right to education, right to health, right to work, liberty and security, freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse, and adequate standard of living. The CRPG also uniquely links Article 32 on international cooperation, including in development assistance, with Article 11 obligations. So what this requires is that states have to take into account the intersection of these two articles. And this places a requirement on donor states to ensure that development projects incorporate principles and standards of the CRPD and don't diminish or limit rights, but enable the fulfillment of rights. And it also requires that development projects are future-proofed to protect people with disabilities in situations of risk. And we can see that with obvious examples that when donor states are working on development projects, that if it's a school, that the school is future-proofed in terms of being able to ensure the protection of people with disabilities and students with disabilities in situations of risk. So emergency egress is accessible and alarm systems are accessible. And so the infrastructure needs to be, it needs to meet the obligations, not just of accessibility in terms of fit for purpose as an education institution, but also to ensure that if in a situation of risk, that people with disabilities have access to the emergency responses. The committee's had a strong focus on Article 11, and through the work of the committee, including its dialogues, its concluding observations, its lists of issues, and during COVID, we had a set question that we put forward to state party during their reviews to see what measures they had taken to ensure that people with disabilities were being protected during the pandemic. We've held sessions on Ukraine to seek further information from states and organisations, from persons with disabilities, to get a sense of what the situation was for people with disabilities in that situation of armed conflict. And we've responded in a joint statement with the UNESCAP Office on Disaster Risk Reduction to the Pakistani floods. And the focus of our guidelines on deinstitutionalisation focus not just on the issue of institutionalisation and moving away from institutionalisation, but also focused on situations of emergency. So the future for the committee is that we are now seeing the importance of developing a general comment on Article 11, whether that is a general comment that focuses on the entirety of the obligations set forth in Article 11, or whether it takes one of the elements, either climate change or humanitarian aid, is something for the committee to decide. But we will decide that in the next couple of months, and we will start work on the general comment in earnest next year. So it's a watching brief for people with disabilities, so to speak. But there are other UN documents that the CRPD principles and standards inform, including the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on persons with disabilities in humanitarian action, and the Incheon Strategy to make the rights real for persons with disability in Asia and the Pacific, and specifically Goal 7, disability inclusive disaster preparedness. So the CRPD sets out the principles and standards for these frameworks and strategies to be operationalised. And it's critical that we learn from the experience of those recent situations, such as the Ukraine and COVID and the various floods and bushfires that have been experienced, to be able to bring people with disabilities into the planning stage to ensure that their rights are protected in situations of risk and emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, for that both in-depth and wide-ranging overview of the perspective from the committee of the CRPD. Now I'd like to turn to Associate Professor Michelle Villeneuve, who will give her thoughts to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Jackie, and thank you to Jackie and all of the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I really am pleased to share our experiences of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction at the grassroots, if you will, in Australia, and a bit of our journey here. Rosemary spoke about the policy sort of framework and the legislative requirements for doing inclusive disaster risk reduction. But when we started our work, we recognized really that the how-to guide was missing for the local people on the ground trying to put it into action. And our research is beginning to really unpack how it is that disability stigma becomes the biggest barrier for people with disability when disasters strike. When we look at our emergency management sector in Australia and the arrangements, and we dig deep into our policy documents guiding how to do disaster risk reduction, and we go searching for whether and how people with disability have been included, we see similar findings across with other countries, of course, that mostly people with disability, as well as other groups at greater risk in disasters, have been overlooked, excluded. And when they are included in those documents, they're typically an afterthought as an appendix to the end of perhaps a health and well-being recovery document or guideline, or to an emergency management plan. We are, however, beginning to see significant changes in Australia. One of the problems that we've been trying to tackle is the starting point of the emergency managers in our emergency sector. Some of that comes from their international directives. One of the goals of the Sendai framework is to make sure that every citizen understands the risk and takes actions to prepare for disasters. So it's guided by the SFDRR to start at that point. But if you have a disability, or if you provide care to someone with a disability, chronic health conditions, or other support needs, this can be a totally overwhelming proposition. People with disability experience individual and social barriers that make it much harder for them to take those preparedness actions. So we're really starting at the wrong place. And so our work with the emergency sector has really been looking at what's a new place for us to begin. Our work took us to the place of recognizing the complete absence of planning tools that took into account the both capabilities and the support needs, as well as the current level of preparedness of people with disability, and including carers of people with disability. Because we didn't have tools that really looked at their capabilities and how to tailor preparedness to their support needs, there was really no starting point for people with disabilities. So we set about building those through a co-design process involving people with disability and their representatives, the services that support them across the wide-ranging and diverse types of services in the community, health, disability, and so on. And with the emergency sector, those working in government and those working with our emergency services agencies. And what we designed was a capability wheel, or a capability framework of 8 elements that really has people with disability supported by others to first self-assess how they manage every day. The reality is people with disability manage uncertainty in everyday life all the time in accessible environments, and they have very adaptive strategies for overcoming those in the everyday. This needs to be the starting point for emergency management planning and actions, because it starts from a position of strength. If we understand how people manage every day, it starts to break down that overwhelming process of preparing for disasters by thinking about who's already in my support network, who do I rely on, who relies on me, and how do I get those supports on an everyday basis. That actually is the starting point and the foundation of our person-centered process for emergency planning. When we started this work in Australia in 2015, disability inclusive disaster risk reduction was not even a part of Australia's disaster management vocabulary. We had the principles, accessibility, participation, non-discrimination, and collaboration, but there were no tools for putting those principles into action, and the how-to guides were completely missing. But I'm really pleased to say that from 2021, when Australia launched its new Australian Disability Strategy, and when the National Disability Insurance Scheme Quality and Safeguarding Commission made their legislative amendment, we really achieved legislative change in this process, and requirements for service providers and all of government and all of community services to pay attention to inclusion in their emergency management planning and practices. So not only do we have the rules, but over that interim period of time, we have been developing the tools that support those practical actions on the ground. The way that we've gone about doing that has really been to engage in a co-design process, which really focuses on an iterative process of inquiry, co-production, and evaluating whether these tools are going to work on the ground. So we build them and we test them in action. And we amplify practices that are working well and build them into the tools, so that we're not creating more work for people, but we're embedding person-centered and capability-focused approaches into practices of the multiple stakeholders who all have a role in keeping people safe and well when disasters strike. What does this actually look like? It really looks like bringing people who do not normally work together to have genuine and open conversations about the risks that people face in emergency situations. It looks like boldly confronting the gaps that people face, that we actually face in our individual and shared responsibilities to manage those risks and to take care of people's emotional well-being, because the conversations that we have are actually really, really hard. And it looks like facilitating shared learning about the potential role and contributions of different stakeholders to increasing the safety and well-being of people with disability before, during, and after disasters. And most importantly, it looks like sustaining that interaction over time by providing lots of opportunities for people to learn and work together. And so we've been doing this in different communities, in different practice contexts, with stakeholders at all levels, from the front line of community to the highest level of decision making. And that's how we've been able to work together at the grassroots to bring about those legislative changes. We need a play space for this to happen. As we build those tools, we need people to access and use them so that they can give us feedback so that we can make the tools better together and so that we can replicate, translate, and scale them in different contexts. That play space is Collaborating for Inclusion, our website, and you're really welcome to visit that website, download tools, and give a go to the resources that we've built there, all co-designed in partnership with people with disability, the services that support them, and the emergency sector. You'll find specifically on that site 2 key streams of what we do. One, focusing on the person-centered planning processes that help every individual and every citizen to make a plan that's tailored to their support needs and situation. And what's really exciting about the person-centered stream of work and the tools we're producing is that people are recognizing that tools built by people with disability are used by everyone. And they're really compelling our whole nation to get ready, starting proximally with where our support needs and situation is at the outset. The other stream of work that you'll see on that website is disability inclusive emergency planning. That really is a facilitated process that looks at planning at a community level, taking and thinking about the unmet needs of people with disability and making sure those are not an afterthought or an appendix in our emergency management plans, but front and center in the community level planning process. So maybe before I just finish up, I'd like to share 3 key learnings from what we've been achieving and learning through the process. 1, the vulnerability approach does not work. We take disability out of the too hard basket when we approach people with disability as capable, having both rights and responsibilities for their safety and well-being in emergencies. Second, the tools we use direct how we work. So we really need to build empowerment and collaborative processes into them. The tools that we've been building are one set of tools that everybody can use, and that promotes and supports collaborative action. We often think that including people with disability builds empowerment for people with disability. And that's true, but we're showing through our research that it's also empowering our emergency services sector who have not had the tools and approaches to keep people with disability safe and to build their inclusion into the process. And we're finding from our emergency services colleagues that they're feeling quite excited and empowered about how they're now able to go about and do their work. And finally, we're definitely showing and sharing that true partnerships really begin with acts of humility. And if we want to achieve shared responsibility in inclusive disaster risk reduction, we will really need humility in spades and an ability to listen and learn together at the grassroots of community. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And finally, we'll turn to Ms. Risnawati Utami for some very specific and insightful contribution to our panel.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm very pleased to see all of you here, and thank you so much for Rosemary for inviting me to in this session. So I would like to build from Rosemary and Michelle about the importance of the human rights law that legally binding to ensure persons with disability have protection when it comes to the situation of risk and humanitarian emergency. Also, how we learn from the community, especially the organization of persons with disabilities and other representative organizations that work on the disaster risk reduction. My point is actually how we can articulate Article 32 in the international cooperations, since I've been working a lot in advocating how international cooperation should be inclusive and we can connect with the disaster risk reductions. So, and within the G20 forum, we've been working together. Actually, I also initiated a disability working group within the G20 forum, and we advocate an approach to the G20 member of states how to create more inclusive international cooperation and addressing the world situation at the moment, like war in the Ukraine, also the disaster risk reduction and other climate change that has been happening in the world. And we trying to assist the government in terms of articulating Article 32 to be more applicable, participatory, and also inclusive in terms of climate change, disaster risk reductions, and also the situation of emergency. We also concerned about the food security that has been happening in the world, the supply and chains of the food security. And under our Civic 20 Indonesia, we trying to work together on how to create a problem solving in terms of these situations. And our Civic 20 Indonesia, including a disability working group, we propose to have a international funding. It's called FIF, funding intermediary fund. So basically, I think the World Bank, we propose to the World Bank on how we can provide this funding to address the complex situation in the world. So I think that this proposal, it might works, you know, to help and also to support the low-income country, especially Pakistan, for example, that has to deal with the big flooding, and basically the resources are very lacking. There are no international support that can address about disability inclusion. And at this point, we would like to propose this kind of the world system that can provide not only just funding, but also technical assistance that can help the country that needs support, that basically is more inclusive and also accessible, and hopefully it becomes sustainable in the future. So addressing the Article 32 in terms of articulating on the ground, the Civic 20 Indonesia, including disability working group that we have been working, now it's already 1 year, and we support the transition from Indonesia to India. And we also emphasize the importance of disaster risk reduction, food security, and good practices, how we can work it out within at least the G20 member of states, and it can be applicate or replicate into other countries. So we are basically utilizing the leadership in the global south at the moment, because the presidency will be Indonesia, and then will be transferred to India, Brazil, and then South Africa. So I think that this kind of cooperation we believe that it can be one of the problem solving in the world, because the G20 is quite a member of state that they, in terms of resources, they are available. So Article 22 should be applicable, inclusive and accessible, but unfortunately, some of the government, they still don't get it, how we implement the international cooperation in addressing the humanitarian emergencies with situation of risk, including disaster risk reduction. So my point is basically how the organization of persons with disability can influence more in terms of implementing inclusive international cooperation, addressing disaster reduction, and also the climate change, because the impact, the worst impact will be faced by persons with disability and other vulnerable groups in the world. So that's why we are trying to influence all government need to work together, partner with the civil society organization, including persons with disabilities, to trying to create more a global solution at this point. And I think the CRPD is very effective tools as a human rights law, and also development tools in terms of addressing disaster risk reduction to be more inclusive, and also supporting the important roles of organization of persons with disabilities. I thank you.
And thank you, Rizina, for that. So we've had three different inputs with different perspectives and expertise on the situation. And to kick off a discussion, I've got a couple of questions here to start with. And please, in the audience, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the Q&A and they will be put to the panel. But first of all, I'm glad you mentioned climate change there, Rizna, because one of the questions is asking, I think, all three of you, about what about the impacts of climate change on disability inclusion, disaster reduction and risk management? Who would like to take that one first? Michelle?
Oh, okay.
Oh, Rosemary.
Michelle?
Sorry, Rosemary.
No, it's fine. Michelle can go first.
We'll go in order. Rosemary, then Michelle.
Climate change presents significant challenges for people with disability. As I mentioned briefly in my remarks, I mean, we're very aware that climate change is something that's having an impact now, and it will continue to have an increasing impact in the future. The Pakistan experience, where they've been experiencing monsoonal rains, which would normally fall 300 kilometres away, are falling in areas that have just not areas where that can deal with that level of water, monsoonal rain falling as concentratedly as it does. And those situations, if there isn't infrastructure for people with disabilities to be able to manage and support, keep their support networks in place, then the impact on them is quite significant. Climate change in small island nations where the sea levels are rising, lots of areas for people with disabilities to be able to live in accessible places is becoming very difficult, because the areas that are only really guaranteed to be away from the rising seas are areas that are too hilly and too remote for people with disabilities to be able to have accessible housing in. So the ability not to just be protected from the situation of emergencies, like the increased number of cyclones that may come through an area, is one thing, but the breakdown of their social networks and their ability to be able to live in their community can be compromised. And so it's not just about responding to the emergencies, it's about having an understanding about what the long-term issues are for people with disabilities and how to minimise those.
Okay, thank you, Rosemary. Michelle.
Yeah, I was thinking in response to this issue of disasters and climate change, it really compels all of us, including people with disability, to be able to anticipate, respond, and adapt over time. But of course, people with disability have had fewer options and fewer choices. And in those situations, it's going to be quite challenging to think about where will people move to, evacuate to, transition their lives to, if climate change adaptation requires us to literally move to new environments. There are absolutely fewer choices for people with disability to manage and navigate those shifts and those changes. The other thing it made me think about was the interdependence of people with disability and the people who support them, whether those are informal supports and services or whether those are formal paid supports and services, and that varies hugely from one country to another and one situation to another. But those are really important considerations in our anticipating, responding, and adapting, because as the people who support and care for people with disability respond, anticipate, and adapt things, their lives and situations are going to change in kind, and that may leave people with disability without adequate supports and services in that process. So I think there's really quite a complex cascading impact of these root causes and impacts.
Yeah. Rithna, would you like to comment?
Yes. So when we talk about climate change and then related to the disaster risk reduction, I think that in the perspective of the government, the government should provide more adaptive social protections. When so we have more flexibility to give access to persons with disabilities, and social protection also very critical when it comes to the situation of risk and humanitarian emergency. And we need to really design how to have adaptive social protection in these situations. I'm also thinking about people in the Ukraine, that they have to be internally displaced person and they have to become refugee, for example, and there is no social protection at all. And I think that this is our homework, that we can, design it. It's more likely to have a more local wisdom, where a person with disability can have equal access in terms of housing, for example, water, and also food when they have to be moved to the different places. And I think that this is kind of quite difficult, system that now we have to think about it. What happened when the adaptive social protection doesn't work and the government doesn't have resources. And I think that this is why we need to have a more like a global funding on how can help people that are internally displaced or become refugees because of the climate change or other disaster, and also humanitarian emergency. So I think that we need to design and we need to do the assessment. What is the best adaptive social protections for several countries? I'm also thinking about Pakistan, how we can create this social protection that are more accessible and easy to access for a person with disability, especially because of the victims of the big flood in Pakistan. Thank you.
So another question that we're talking about very generally about the Asia Pacific region, a vast area, very different countries with very different levels of resources, and also very different cultures, particularly around disability, illness, impairment, and so on. So I wondered if any of you would want to comment about, how does one manage that difference and disparity in an efficient way? Should we do Rosemary, Michelle, and Rithna again in that order?
Sure. For me, the automatic response to that answer is that anything we do, we've got to start locally. Right? If you don't have local connections, if you don't have local understanding, the history is shown with, just development. Let's take development as an example. It shows that if it tries to be imported, so if we just import something from somewhere else, it generally doesn't work. So we need to start locally. And I mean, it just reinforces the position of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that says you need to start with people with disability. So essentially you should start locally, and you can take frameworks that can be reworked in local situations, but you need to take the expertise and the knowledge and the local knowledge and build that into existing frameworks, or start from scratch if those existing frameworks can't work in that context. Because you're quite right, from West Asia to the outer Pacific, you're looking at a myriad of cultures and languages and lifestyles, and also a context of understanding disability, that is very, very different. And the approaches will be very, very different in each of those areas, and even internally within countries. I mean, we could say that for our own country, Australia, that the difference in the way that the Indigenous population understand and respond to disability can be seen as very different to what modern day Australia does in its highly service framed response to disability.
Okay. Michelle.
I guess that makes me think quite a lot about how we might consider the call to action in the Sendai framework for people-centered approaches to disaster risk. So if we think about people-centered approaches, we may think about people and their cultures in their context in which they live, work, and play. And maybe this discussion has me thinking about how we make sure that we do that. I was speaking with a Maori colleague from New Zealand, for example, who was able to put a lens over our person-centered resources and tools by having a cultural sort of reflection on what that would mean in a New Zealand and in a Maori context. I was having conversations just last week with the Aboriginal housing and homelessness sector about what it might look like to take the principles of person-centered emergency preparedness and make them inviting for Aboriginal communities. What would that look like? It would certainly, he says, involve a completely different look and feel in terms of artwork to make the resource in the first instance inviting to people. Welcoming and safe were some of the words that he used in that space. What's been really exciting, I suppose, about the work that we're doing is we're keeping the principles of what's the starting point and what are we aiming for in terms of keeping people safe, and starting proximally with the individual themselves and their own self-assessment process. But we're really working with each individual community. As Rosemary says, it needs to start local. So we're working with each individual, each service provider, each community to decide how the implementation of person-centered emergency preparedness looks for them, for their organization, for their community. I actually think that that's been one of the parts of our success in scaling person-centered emergency preparedness, because it's not a cookie cutter, take this, do it exactly this way in your community. It's also made it challenging for people because it takes some effort to take something and take the effort and the time to work locally and to give it the shape that it needs and to give it the time that it needs to be embedded. So I think that also is a process in itself.
Okay, thank you. Rizna, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think it's quite complex how we can address about the situation in Asia and the Pacific, because it has, like Rosemary said, there are cultural difference, so many different contexts, lifestyle in Asia and the Pacific. And I'm thinking about not just the roles of persons with disability, but also the United Nations agencies at some point, because they also have work to do in terms of implementing United Nations Disability Inclusive Strategy. And maybe this is one of the UN agency in Indonesia. I have to mention because the World Food Program decided to work with my organization to do the scoping exercise in terms of food security, climate change, emergency preparedness in Indonesia. So they pick Indonesia as one of the scoping exercise in terms of identify the situation of persons with disabilities in climate change, social protection, also in emergency preparedness and food security. And I think that since the UN is one of the agency that has responsibility globally to address and also to protect the rights of persons with disability based on the convention, I think that the UNWFP trying to create like affirmative action on how to address the situation. And since Indonesia is having 70,000 island, and we've been dealing with earthquake and also flooding lately, and lots of rains. And I can also share about our scoping exercise in 7 regions in Indonesia, but it's not yet done. But it's quite impressive and interesting research that we have been doing. At the moment, we are still ongoing research, and I think that this is kind of affirmative action, how the United Nations body take action on how to portray the situation of persons with disability, and also implementing the UN disability inclusive strategy on the ground. Because I think Rosemary knows about the United Nations Disability Inclusive Strategy, not yet implemented within the UN body. So so that's why we are trying to push how we can be more inclusive and how to be more implemented. And I think this is the first time the UN body in Indonesia, together with the Organization of Persons with Disability, doing the scoping exercise. And we are so impressed actually working together with them, because they need to learn from us on how to make more accessibility and also reasonable accommodation in terms of disaster risk reduction, social protection, and also how we deal the food security. And this is kind of a piece of research that happened in ASEAN Pacific, because they pick Indonesia as one of the example. And then we will launch this scoping exercise on December 3rd on International Disability Day. So maybe this is kind of, thinking how the UN have to do something in terms of doing disability inclusive strategy, in terms of disaster reduction, and also climate change.
That's fantastic. Thank you. We have about 6 or so minutes before the end of our time. So I'd like to end with one wrap-up question to all of you, really, which is that obviously this is a side event at the Intergovernmental meeting on the final review of the Asian and Pacific Decade of Persons with Disabilities, 2013-2022. So thinking of that decade, do you feel, each of you, that the situation over the time in the Asia Pacific has improved for people with disability, particularly perhaps in the context of disaster and humanitarian emergencies? Has it improved? Has it stayed the same? Has it, hopefully not, got worse? What are your thoughts, and where are we going? Rosemary.
Look, it's not been stagnant, but I think most of the change has been within civil society. And I'd say that's within organisations of persons with disabilities. And I'd say that people with disability and their representative organisations have become much more organised and much more understanding of the opportunities for them to advocate for greater participation in this space. And I think that drives pockets of change. I can't confidently say that there has been dramatic change in any particular country, but there are pockets of change. And I think Michelle's work demonstrates that. I think the projects that Rishna highlighted also shows that there's now a focus on it, and there's now an understanding that, yes, there are obligations that are held by states, but I think the energy is coming from people with disabilities. And that's not surprising. I mean, we're the people that bear the brunt of the effects of all this. So we are the ones that have a vested interest in driving change. But I really do think that we're still only seeing pockets of change, as opposed to some really strong government-based short-term, medium-term, long-term structural frameworks to drive really holistic change.
Okay, thank you. Michelle.
Oh, thanks, Rosemary. I think you're right that progressive movement from consciousness raising to collective advocacy to collaboration is in motion. It's well in motion in varying degrees across the Asia Pacific, absolutely. And it's spearheaded most successfully in my observations when disability representative organizations are leading the charge and when they're resourced and enabled to do so. I think that's really a critical feature of it. I think, Jackie, I'd like to be able to answer that question in 12 to 24 months. We've spent the last 12 to 18 months co-designing and then undertaking national surveys and significant amount of document analysis across all of Australia, across the whole emergency management and disability inclusion documents and legislation. And we're getting the first baseline understanding. The problem is that we have never had access to data about the capabilities and the support needs and the roles of different stakeholders and how will each take their part in this space. And so we've undertaken a massive initiative to get that baseline understanding. The story is showing some good features. I liked Rosemary's characterization, pockets of change. Queensland's a very good example where we've had lots of resourcing, dedicated support, emergency management arrangements that enable it, and well-resourced, activated disabled people's organization now leading that work. And we're seeing proliferation throughout policy and practice and across sectors in Queensland. And that's making an impact in other areas. I think it's been really critical for us to get this baseline data and count so that we might in the future be able to show that progressive change where and how that's happening.
And very briefly, finally, Rizna.
Thank you. Yes, well, I agree with Rosemary that the progress has not been equally progressed in ASEAN Pacific. But I think that we just still need to do more advocacy work in the perspective of the disability rights movement on how to progress disability inclusion in situation of risk and also the humanitarian emergencies. Because I think the level of understanding of disability inclusion and also the CRPD is not yet equally fulfilled or basically reached by all government in ASEAN Pacific. So we need to have more capacity building. Maybe Australia has more advanced, especially the work of that Michelle has been doing, and also Rosemary. I think we need to do more capacity building, especially for the government in terms of doing more technical and in terms of accessible and inclusive disaster risk reduction, because this is still a big homework for the country that has very low resources in the country level. And I think that we need to have more exchange in terms of knowledge and also good practice and also capacity building for the country in the ASEAN Pacific. And of course, we need to involve and also engage organizations of persons with disability to work together with the government. And also the roles of the academia, your center to work together with persons with disability and their representative organization, because that's kind of a very good investment in terms of knowledge transfer, and we can initiate and do more innovative measure to ensure the government really reliable and accountable in articulating Article 11 of the CRPD, and also the 32 international cooperation on how we connect these two articles can be implemented at the country level. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. That's great. So pockets of change, pockets of light, but we need more structural change to have impact in the short, medium and long term. We need more data and better data. We need better exchange of knowledge and practice, and particularly partnerships and exchanges between academia and other partners. So I think with those comments, I'll draw this side event to a close. Thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks to our panel, and have a good rest of the meeting.
Thank you so much, Jackie, Rosemary and Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you all. It was great chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you everyone. It was great.